Are you a fan of in-depth conversations on a wide variety of subjects? Then you need to head out on the open highway. I'm Eric Erickson. I bring my crazy career and interests in a variety of subjects to the show, and since I seem to know, a little bit about everything, it's just enough to get me into trouble. The open highway is like going on a road trip and meeting all different sorts of people. It's that old idea of sitting at that diner counter, having coffee, and talking with folks with completely different backgrounds. One episode might be a political operative, the next a professional wrestler, and the next a philosopher. Just having good old-fashioned conversation. If it's interesting to me, I'm sure it'll be interesting to you too. The Open Highway. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. Get them wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
What happens when you record a podcast and none of the audio captures? After contemplating your life choices and wondering why you even do this in the first place, you sit down and you record a take two. It's Our Weird World.
Our Weird World.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and like last year around this time, D-Day, we looked at some World War II stories, and we're going to continue that theme with several heroes, unsung, lesser-known heroes from World War II. We're going to look at the stories of Jack Churchill, Simo Häyhä, Etta Roble, David Sillito, Digby Tatum Warder, and Maria Oktyabrskaya. So, 6 stories, a lot to get into. Let's go ahead and jump into it. Story time. That's got to be a record, right? Like, barely a minute and a half into this thing, and we are already into the stories. We're starting with the story of John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, or known by Jack for some reason. He only needed 4 things in his life. He needed his bagpipe, a longbow, a sword, and someone to use those things on. Churchill graduated from the Royal Military College in the United Kingdom and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma. I'm sure those mean things to people in England. Just sounds like he did a thing and went in the army. Unfortunately for him, there wasn't a lot of fighting going on in Burma, so Churchill left the army in 1936 and made a weird career choice. All right, he moved to Kenya, where he was a newspaper editor and a model. He also appeared in 2 movies and won second place in the 1938 military bagpipe competition, and he represented Great Britain at the 1939 World Archery Championships. So, look, we all have hobbies. Some people's a little stranger than others. Germany's invasion of Poland later in 1939 could not have made Churchill any happier. Because, I mean, look, if you're competing in archery and bagpipe competitions, you already have too much free time on your hands. And if you like war, then this is right up your alley. Churchill joined the British Expeditionary Force in France, where his unit attacked a German patrol near L'Epinette. During the battle, Churchill gave the signal to take out a nearby German staff sergeant with a barbed arrow, but this is World War II, and no one in the regiment had any idea that there was a hand signal for shooting someone with a barbed arrow. And once Churchill figured that out, he just did it himself, and he is the only known British soldier during World War II to kill someone with a bow and arrow. After that, Churchill then volunteered to join the Commandos without really knowing what it was, other than it just sounded cool. By 1941, Churchill was second in command of his unit, and the Commandos were assigned to be part of Operation Archery in Norway, which on paper, Churchill's probably like, this is for me. Operation Archery? Say no more, gents. Like, send me on my way. And then he was probably super disappointed when he learned that Operation Archery had nothing to do with actual archery. When the landing crafts arrived at their destination in Norway, Churchill jumped forward from his position and played March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipe. I don't know what that song sounds like. I could have looked it up and I could have played it for you, but I didn't. So we're moving on. He then chucked a grenade onto the battlefield and stormed the city to fight the Germans. After Norway, Churchill's men were sent to Italy, where his platoon successfully invaded the Nazi-held countryside. Churchill then captured 42 Germans and a mortar squad in the middle of the night with nothing but his sword. Like, how bad are you at war when your entire platoon just gets taken over by a dude with a sword? Like, I can see that working for like all of like 10 seconds. And then like once you realize, oh, it's just a dude with a sword, like he doesn't have anything that can actually kill all of us, then you just shoot him and it's done. But that's not what happened. And then after that, Churchill was sent to Yugoslavia to raid the island of Brac. I think it's Brac. It's BRAC, but there's like a weird, like one of those weird, like Eastern European symbols over the top of it, like a Czech symbol. I think it's Brac, which that island was also being held by the Germans. And on the way to Brac, Churchill gathered 1,500 allies to support his commando unit to take the island. But after seeing the ungodly number of artillery nests on the island, the entire group, I guess minus Churchill, decided they were just going to wait overnight and attack the next day. Churchill did not care at all, and he began playing his bagpipes until everyone in the unit got annoyed of the sound and decided to go to battle. Look, he's in bagpipe competition, so he can't be that bad. So how bad do you hate bagpipes that you are willing to go and fight a heavily protected island again? That's like, there's hundreds, if not thousands of Germans waiting to kill you. And you would rather go and potentially die than continue to listen to this dude on his bagpipe. I can't imagine. When the Germans called in air support during the invasion, Churchill quickly withdrew his unit and made plans to return in the morning. So everybody ended up getting their way. The next day, however, the Allies decided that it still wasn't a great idea to attack the island and stayed back. So Churchill took the rest of his smaller commando unit and stormed the island again. Within minutes, all but 6 of Churchill's men were dead, and those that were still alive were severely wounded. I mean, they were all kinds of messed up. Churchill, who was apparently just completely impervious to bullets and mortar fire, began playing Will Ye Come No Back Again, Will Ye No Come Back Again, there we go, on his bagpipes, which, again, I don't know what that song sounds like. Could have found it and played it, but I didn't. This is take 2, and I'm not doing it. What's odd about this choice, though, that Churchill made was that it alerted the Germans to his position, because honestly, it's probably not difficult to find somebody rocking out on a bagpipe, especially on an island, especially when you've spent the last couple of hours decimating your opponent. Churchill was then knocked unconscious by a grenade and captured by the Germans. The Germans then flew Churchill to Berlin for interrogation before transferring him to a concentration camp in Oranienburg. But Churchill wasn't about to just waste away in some concentration camp. 4 months later, he and Royal Air Force officer Bertram James crawled under a wire and threw a drain pipe out of the prison like they were Andy Dufresne from Shawshank Redemption. I will say, the first time I recorded this, I could not remember the name of the movie. I said Green Mile, knowing that it was probably wrong, but it's Shawshank Redemption. And so, whatever. I don't watch movies, you guys. Like, I do this. I write books. I play golf sometimes. And I watch a lot of sports. That doesn't leave a lot of time for movies. So, get off my dick. All right? Those two men, I don't know why I got so defensive over that. The two men then walked over 100 miles toward the Baltic coast before being captured in Rostock. The next year, Churchill was transferred with a group of prisoners to Tyrol when a disagreement broke out between SS troops and the German army, the prisoners were just all granted release, and Churchill then walked 90 miles to Verona, Italy, where he met an American unit. And by then, the war in Europe was pretty much done at this point. But Churchill, like, he wanted to keep fighting. So he went to Burma. He's sent to Burma, where the largest land battles of the Pacific side of the war were still kind of being fought. But unfortunately, by the time he arrived in India, the Americans had dropped the atomic bombs on Japan and effectively ended the war. And Churchill was furious. Not because the Americans had dropped atomic bombs and ushered in a new era of warfare that could potentially bring about the end of humanity, but because he still wanted to keep fighting. Like a direct quote, once he heard the news of the Japanese surrender, he said, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. I don't know if he sounded like that, but that's the accent that I gave him. So that is Churchill's story. Next is the story of Simo Häyhä, who was born on December 17th, 1905 in the tiny Finnish town of Rautjärvi, near the Russian border. That's the only way I can say that is if I do Swedish chef voice. 20 years later, he joined the military because he loved shooting things. And when the Winter War broke out in 1939 between Finland and the Soviet Union, Simo was sent to Kola as a sniper. Now, the Red Army, thanks to Stalin's purge of his best military experts, was horribly underprepared for this war. Temperatures never got higher than -4 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Russians stood out among the snowy landscape because no one had thought to give them white camouflage. Like, there's a reason they were called the Red Army. I think it's because they were wearing red. Maybe they wore black sometimes, but they weren't wearing white. I can tell you that. They weren't camouflaged in the snow. Even more, like, the Russians were just horribly disorganized, and they made themselves easy targets for Simo to just keep picking them off. In fewer than 100 days, this is insane, Simo had sniped 219 Russians, confirmed. When he ran out of bullets for his rifle, he then took out his submachine gun and continued picking off any Russian walking in the middle of the snowy fields. And look, I've played enough Call of Duty to know that it is much easier to snipe with a sniper rifle than it is a submachine gun. Like, submachine guns typically for closer combat versus sniper rifle, you know, you can really do some damage from distance. On February 17th, 1940, Simo, who is nicknamed the White Death at this point, was given an honorary rifle by his division commander. And the Russians, in an attempt to get rid of him, because they're still trying to figure it out, used counter snipers and artillery strikes, but they just couldn't find him. Like, they're shooting all willy-nilly all over the snow, but they just can't find him. And mainly that's because Simo had kind of figured out a way to conceal himself even further by packing dense snow in front of his position. So, like, not only did this keep him hidden, but it greatly reduced the puff of snow that occurred when he fired his rifle on top of it. And this is genius too. He even kept snow in his mouth at all times to prevent the steam from his breath rising into the air and giving himself away. On March 6th, however, a Russian soldier finally hit Simo in the face with an exploding bullet. This crushed his jaw and blew off the entire left cheek off of his face. But, like, come on, you're not going to just take out White Death like that. He was left unconscious and stayed in a Finnish hospital for over a week. But on March 13th, the day the Winter War ended, Simo woke up and he called it a career at that point, and he finished with 259 confirmed sniper kills and a similar number of submachine gun kills. So, I mean, you're looking at 500 or more kills by one dude. He eventually died on April 1st, 2002 in a nursing home in Finland. Next story here, a little bit of a shorter one. Story of Etta Robel, who was born on December 28th, 1918 in Lwów, Poland, or maybe it's Lwów. I think it's Lwów. When the Nazis invaded Poland, Etta helped her fellow Jews by forging false identity papers to keep them safe. But in October of 1942, the ghetto where she had been placed in by the Nazis was liquidated, which meant she was just off to concentration camp to probably eventually die. And during the transportation to the camp, Etta and her father escaped, leaving her mother and 7 other siblings behind. So, unfortunate for sure, because I do believe they ended up getting killed. But she and her dad made an escape, and they made the most of it. While on the run, Edda organized an army of over 70 Jews, and they just kept sneaking around Lwów, stealing Nazi supplies, and just making life miserable for the Germans, as they should. Edda, during one little skirmish, got shot in the leg, but the unit's only doctor was really busy kind of saving other people with more serious injuries. And so the doctor threw her a knife, a bottle of vodka, and basically just gave her a brief how-to while he's like trying to patch up another patient. And Edda, seeing that this was more than enough information, dug the bullet out of her own leg and then sterilized the wound with vodka. And because we as a society are conditioned to think that women doing things like this is super awesome and, you know, worthy of special attention, that's why she's in this book, or in this podcast. It's also in a book. But like, to me, like, cool. Like, you do what you got to do to survive. Like, it shouldn't matter that she did it because she's a woman. Like, she did it because she's a great person with a tenacity to keep living. I don't know. I hate the whole pandering to women and minorities because they do things that everyone can do, but it seems more special because they were a woman or a minority. I know I'm not articulating this point properly. I feel like it's coming from good intentions. Basically, I just want people to be treated equally. That's it. That's all I'm trying to get at. Edda's Jew army, back to the story. They spent the next 2 years blowing up Nazi units with mines, cutting off their supply units, and even more. She was the only woman in this unit who refused to cook or clean. Like, she's not doing any stereotypical woman stuff. All right, she's going and fighting with the dudes. All right. Anyway, I don't know why I said it like that. She definitely did prefer blowing up Nazi stuff with the men rather than staying behind and cooking and cleaning with the women. When the Nazis left Poland in 1944, Edda emerged from the woods and was hailed as a hero. She even went on to be nominated for mayor of Lwów. After the war, she then met a man named Henry, married him, and moved to New Jersey, where they had 3 children together. And she died peacefully and lived a full life on May 26th, 2008. Next story here. For some reason, everybody seems to forget that World War II was fought a lot in North Africa for some reason. I still don't know why, but it's not really talked a lot. But David Salido was a British Special Air Service trooper who was part of a mission to bomb a German train traveling somewhere in the Sahara Desert in 1942. Salido, along with 3 other soldiers, drove over 400 miles out to the railway line to set up the attack. At midnight, they sneaked through the desert from where they parked their Jeep to get to the train. But when they arrived at their spot, they were surprised to hear some music playing, and even more surprised to find a group of Italian soldiers just kind of hanging out and guarding the spot. Salido's group decided to attack the Italian camp with their standard issue revolvers and a single Tommy gun, which would have been fine, except the Italians responded with grenades and full-sized machine guns. So being massively outgunned, Salido kind of got separated from his group and pressed himself into the sand to avoid the fire while he crawled away to safety. 3 hours later, he arrived back where the group had parked their Jeeps, only to find that his 3 companions had left him behind. And at this point, Salido kind of had 3 choices. He could go back and surrender to the Italians, which probably would not work out in his favor. He could walk along the Mediterranean coast for 300 miles to a British outpost, which also probably wouldn't work out in his favor. Or he could walk 140 miles to a settlement where he could get food and water, which he did not have any of at the moment. That one probably also statistically wouldn't work out in his favor, but it was the least of the 3 evils. So he set off into the desert with just a compass and a revolver. He spent the next 2 days siphoning any remaining traces of water from cans that were strewn across the battlefields. On day 3, he happened upon an abandoned British tank and he was just delighted to find a can of beef. Canned beef. Ew. Like, gross. Unfortunately for Salito, he was so dehydrated at this point that he was unable to actually swallow the food, and it was probably already saturated with salt to begin with, so it probably didn't make things better. As he continued through the desert, though, his shoes began to disintegrate from the intense heat. On day 6, Salito spotted 3 British jeeps speeding along the desert, and he tried to shout to get their attention, but he had lost his voice because he was just so dehydrated. He ripped his shirt off and somehow set it on fire, but the jeeps kept going, and now, bitterly disappointed, and now he's without a shirt in the middle of the desert where there is no shade. Salito, he decides to just kill himself. Like, it's not worth it anymore. It's just going to keep, just not going to try to keep going. And so he picked up a stone and tried to bash his skull, but he was so weak that he could barely muster just a small tap to his head. He then tried to bury himself alive in the sand, but he eventually realized that was just a really stupid way to try to kill himself. And at that point, he just resolved to just keep walking. And he would just walk until he either found civilization or he just died from exhaustion. On day 7, Salito stumbled across a series of jeep tracks, and he began following them to the valley where he was certain he was going to find supplies. But when he got to the camp, the place was completely empty. He figured he had arrived at the wrong place and decided to just walk back. But 20 miles in, he stumbled across a pack that one of his men that he had originally showed up with, one of his men had lost in the jeep ride out to their initial mission of bombing that German train. And this filled him with hope. So he figured he had actually gotten to the right place, and he walked 20 miles then back to that original camp. When he arrived back, he was disappointed to see that there was still no other British soldiers around. And then suddenly, like a movie where this unrealistic thunderstorm appears out of nowhere in the desert and saves the hero, an unrealistic thunderstorm appeared out of nowhere in the desert and saved the hero. Within minutes, this camp was inundated with water, and Salito just rolled and played around in the pools before he passed out. The next day, Salito was awoken by the sound of British voices who had arrived back at the camp, and that was it. He was saved. He had spent over a week without food and very little water and had walked 180 miles through the Sahara Desert. Unfortunately for Salito, though, his fellow soldiers weren't able to get him to the hospital in time before he died of severe dehydration and heat stroke. So, no, I'm just kidding. He was actually back in combat a month later because this guy's clearly a superhuman, and he's way better than any of us are right now. He would probably look at all of us right now, just be like, oh, you think you're so cool with your little podcast. Yeah, I spent a week in the desert and almost died. Anyway, our next story here is the story of Alison Digby Tatham Warter, who was the second son born to English parents who clearly wanted their child to be mercilessly mocked for his stupid name. Digby's father died when he was 11 years old after he was gassed in the trenches of World War I. But other than that, Digby went on to have a relatively normal childhood and graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, where he then joined the British Army in India as a second lieutenant. Thanks to his family's connections, that deployment to India allowed him to pursue his favorite pastimes, which included pig sticking and tiger hunting, which, those are the snootiest sounding British hobbies to possibly have. Tiger hunting, okay. Pig sticking, what is that? I think it's like spear hunting for pigs. Weird. When World War II began, Digby requested a transfer to the parachute regiment after hearing his brother had been killed in combat. After receiving his assignment and training, Digby led his men into the Battle of Arnhem in Denmark. But because he was really concerned about the reliability of the infantry's radios, Digby taught his men how to use bugles, which actually hadn't been used since the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, over 100 years ago. Digby also had another problem, and he had another reason for doing this. He could not remember the secret passwords and code words to save his life. And so to fix that, he decided to carry an umbrella with him wherever he went because he believed that anyone who saw him would easily recognize him because in his words, only a bloody fool of an Englishman would carry an umbrella with him during a war. When Digby arrived at Arnhem, Digby, who was also wearing a bowler hat because he just couldn't help looking super ridiculous, he led his men through the backyards of neighborhood homes to avoid the Germans, who were obviously occupying the streets with their tanks. As they advanced, an explosion rang out, sending shrapnel flying through the air and blowing out the rear of Digby's pants. And look, classic Digby, all right? He's got his umbrella and his bowler hat and his white pasty butt cheeks just blowing in the wind, free for all the world to see. He even disabled an armored vehicle by thrusting his umbrella handle through the observation slit and stabbing the driver's eye. Not sure if he was still relatively pantsless when that happened, or maybe it happened on another day, but it happened nonetheless. Digby, though, was eventually captured and sent to a German hospital, but I mean, like, obviously he didn't care, and he escaped through a window with his second in command. He then used the buttons on his uniform to somehow create a working compass, and he worked with several Dutch families to disguise themselves and keep, continuing to like move people to safety. He also ended up obtaining a fake ID and pretended to be Peter Jensen, who was a deaf and mute son of a local lawyer. And then he used a bicycle to visit other English soldiers in hiding, just kind of playing this role of this deaf little Dutch boy. And it worked. It worked. Like, the Nazis didn't recognize him at all. And at one point, Digby actually helped the Nazis retrieve one of their cars that had rolled off into the ditch. And he's just like, "Hello, young boy, young man, would you come and help us? We have seemed to lost our car in the ditch over here. Can you help us retrieve it?" "I know. "Oh, it seems that you cannot hear me, and it seems that you cannot speak because of your disability. I said, if you were a Jew, we would kill you right here on the spot, but this is not our assignment. We need to get this car. We will address this later. But will you come and help us?" Anyway, I don't know. That's how I assume deaf people sound when they talk. So he did it, though, to kind of avoid raising any suspicions. And after weeks of planning, Digby ended up gathering 150 escaped English soldiers on bicycles and led them back to safety. Following World War II, Digby served in Palestine and Kenya, where he eventually retired from the military life and created the modern safari, where people are photograph animals instead of hunting them. So if you've ever gone on an African safari where you ride around in a Jeep and take pictures of things, you have Digby Tatamorter to thank for that. Our final story here is of Maria Oktyabrskaya, who was one of 10 children born to a poor family on the Crimean Peninsula in eastern Russia. She worked in a cannery and also as a telephone operator before marrying a Soviet army soldier in 1925. From there, she was super into her husband's hobby and career, more of like a career, I guess. But she became intensely interested in the military life. She joined the Military Wives Council, learned how to use weapons and military vehicles, and even trained as a nurse to go help during the war. This, of course, goes against what a large number of American women do when they marry a serviceman, which is just cheat on their soldier husbands with his best friend and then collect that sweet government paycheck when they get divorced. I know that's not all military wives, but man, I grew up in eastern North Carolina, and between Fort Bragg, Seymour Johnson, and Camp Lejeune, I heard so many stories about that happening. Just morally bankrupt women who marry into the military because they think it's going to be a sweet life, getting paid for, everything paid for by the government, all that kind of stuff, go live in exotic locations like Fayetteville, North Carolina. No, I mean, they get those, they marry in hoping they get, assigned to like San Diego or, somewhere tropical, but it didn't work out. Anyway, back to our story. When the Great Patriotic War broke out, which is Russia's name for World War II, Maria was evacuated to Siberia. And meanwhile, while she's up in Siberia, her husband was killed by the Nazis near Kiev, Ukraine in 1941. News, though, of her husband's death did not reach her for 2 years. And this really pissed her off. Not necessarily the fact that her husband was dead, or not necessarily the fact that it took 2 years to find out her husband was dead, but just the fact that he was dead. And she vowed to exact the most revenge possible on the Nazis. Maria immediately sold all of her possessions and bought a T-34 tank because apparently those were just readily available for purchase in Russia in the 1940s. Like, just like tank dealerships. I guess you just go buy a tank. She then donated that tank to the Russian army under 2 conditions. 1, that they name it the Fighting Girlfriend, and 2, that they let her drive it in the war. After a short 5-month training session, Maria was then sent to battle with the Fighting Girlfriend tank and immediately began blowing up Nazis in Smolensk in 1943. She drove her tank all through the battlefield, taking out Nazi machine and artillery guns. Whenever the tank was hit with gunfire and disabled, Maria ignored orders to stay inside and jumped out in the middle of the battle and started making repairs. After Smolensk, she was promoted to sergeant. She's doing great. And then the next month, she drove her tank through Novoye Selo and captured the town in the middle of the night. During that battle, though, her tank was hit with an artillery shell and disabled because the explosion damaged the caterpillar tracks on the tank, which forced her to surrender. No, that's not true. She jumped out of that tank like she did the last time and made repairs before returning to battle and finishing the mission. 2 months later, Maria's tank and the rest of the Russian army unit that she was in was attacked the town of Shvedi. Maria drove her tank through German trenches and machine gun nests because she just hadn't gotten enough revenge yet. And as Maria's battles tended to go, she got hit by another shell and disabled the tank. So, of course, she got out and tried to make repairs again because it had gone so well the first 2 times. But unfortunately, this time, she got bonked on the head with an errant piece of shrapnel from another explosion and was knocked unconscious. She was transported to a nearby field hospital where she then died of her injuries 2 months later. The following year, she was given the Hero of the Soviet Union Award for her bravery. And that is the end of our stories. I mean, like realistically speaking, the PTSD that these guys and gals had to have following the wars that they were in, following World War II, had to be intense. All right. But look, we don't talk about that because PTSD wasn't invented until after the Vietnam War. Obviously, we know this, guys. No, I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm just being a dick for no reason. Let's see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number 1, what's his face? Simo Häyhä. I'm looking right at it. Simo Häyhä, nicknamed the White Death, sniped over 250 people and also killed an equal number with his submachine gun. Number 2, David Salido survived in the Sahara Desert for a week with no food, very little water, and then he went right back to war a month later because he is better than all of us combined. And number 3, Digby Tadham Water, just thought it was totally fine to go into battle wearing a bowler hat with an umbrella, and apparently his pasty white butt exposed to the world didn't matter, and he got the job done because he pretended to be deaf and mute to fool the Nazis, who clearly were very easily fooled. So, good on ya. Next week on Our Weird World, we continue kind of the war theme, except it's not going to be as inspiring. Next week's episode is just going to be a reminder of how fortunate we are to be alive, because the Cold War and just kind of the willy-nilly way that the government went about taking care of its nukes is horrifying. We are going to look at 2 stories next week about times when the United States accidentally dropped bombs on itself. Nuclear bombs, by the way. And it could have been so much worse. Ironically, both stories happen in the Carolinas, so I don't know what's going on there. But yeah, that's what's going on next week. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.